Around midnight in December 1991, a rookie police officer was patrolling a neighborhood in Austin, Texas, when he noticed smoke rising from a small strip mall. He immediately radioed the fire department. When firefighters arrived, they rushed inside and began battling the flames to save the building. But when the smoke finally cleared, they made a discovery that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Lying in the burned-out back room of a small yogurt shop were the bodies of 4 young girls, lifeless and badly burned. 3 of them had been bound and gagged with their own underwear. Each had been shot in the head, execution style. The 4th girl was found apart from the others, in a separate part of the store, with a sock-like cloth wrapped around her neck. She, too, had been shot in the head like the others, but that first bullet missed her brain. A second shot did not miss. It tore through her skull and out of her jaw. The fire, and the water used to fight it, destroyed much of the crime scene, and this would cripple the investigation for years. More than 50 people would go on to falsely confess to the murders. 2 men would be wrongfully convicted and sent away, one of them to death row. But the real killer was a man police never once suspected, a name that would not surface for 34 long years. And when his identity was finally revealed, investigators would realize they were looking at one of the most prolific and depraved serial killers in American history. This is the story of Amy Ayers, Eliza Thomas, Jennifer Harbison, and Sarah Harbison, the 4 girls murdered inside the I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop, and the 3-decade nightmare it took to finally catch the man responsible. If you're new to this channel, this is exactly the kind of case we cover here. Cases where killers think they've gotten away with it, sometimes for decades, only to be caught in the end. So if that's the kind of story that keeps you up at night, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. The Austin of 1991 was not yet the booming tech city it is today. It was still a mid-sized Texas town, growing fast but still holding on to that small-town feeling, where people generally felt safe, letting their teenagers work part-time jobs and hang around the mall after school. There were no smartphones, no security cameras on every corner, no way to track a missing teenager in seconds. If something happened to you and no one saw it, it could simply swallow you whole. At the same time, a shadow already hung over the city. A convicted killer named Kenneth McDuff, a man with a documented history of murdering teenagers, had recently been released from prison and was active in the region. When the yogurt shop murders happened, investigators immediately thought of him. He would spend years as a suspect in the public imagination, even confessing to the crime himself on the day of his execution for other murders. But he was not the man responsible, as it would later be proven that the real killer was a monster almost nobody had ever heard of. The I Can't Believe It's Yogurt shop sat in a strip mall in South Austin, the kind of place teenagers worked after school for spending money. Jennifer Harbison, 17 years old, worked there. She was known as the responsible one, dependable, someone who could be trusted to close up at night. Her co-worker, Eliza Thomas, also 17, was a stickler for the rules, always doing things by the book. The 2 of them had worked together many times before and had the closing routine down to a science. Jennifer had a younger sister, Sarah, 15 years old, and Sarah had a close friend named Amy Ayers, just 13. The 4 girls all knew each other through a shared love of animals and the outdoors, having met through a youth group focused on farming and agriculture. Jennifer and Sarah were known as tomboys, close and fiercely loyal to each other. Sarah had a strong personality, the kind of girl who naturally took charge. Amy, the youngest of the group, was often described as wise beyond her years, an old soul. On the evening of Friday, December 6, 1991, Jennifer dropped Sarah and Amy off at a nearby mall while she went to start her shift. When the mall closed around 9 that night, Jennifer picked the 2 younger girls up and brought them back to the yogurt shop to wait for her and Eliza to finish closing. They ordered a pizza, It was meant to be an ordinary night, the kind that happens 1,000 times over in any American town. Sarah and Amy were simply waiting for a ride home. None of the four girls could have known that, sometime earlier that evening, a man had walked into the shop and asked to use the restroom in the back. He was let in. Investigators would later believe he never truly left. They suspect he waited quietly in the back and may have propped open the rear door so he could slip back inside once the shop had emptied out. At around 10:42 p.m., Eliza rang up the last customers of the night, a young couple who would later tell police something felt off before they even left the building. They noticed two men sitting at a table near the front, doing nothing, ordering nothing, just sitting there. The woman in the couple would later say she had an uneasy feeling, like something was wrong, even though nothing seemed obviously out of place. She recalled that the two strangers seemed to be listening closely as Jennifer and Eliza chatted about their upcoming work schedules. The couple left. The two employees began closing procedures. Sarah and Amy waited patiently nearby, and somewhere in the shop, a predator was watching and waiting for his moment. Just before midnight, an Austin patrol officer driving through the area noticed smoke pouring from the strip mall. He radioed it in immediately. Fire crews arrived within minutes, expecting a routine structure fire, something to be knocked down before it spread to neighboring stores. Instead, once the flames were beaten back, they walked into a scene that would stay with every one of them for the rest of their careers. 4 bodies, all girls, all young, all nude, and all showing clear signs of having been bound before they died. Jennifer, Eliza, and Sarah were found together, bound and gagged with pieces of their own clothing, each one shot once in the back of the head at close range with a small caliber pistol. Their bodies had been badly burned in the fire that the killer set, almost certainly in an attempt to destroy any evidence that could point back to him. Amy was found somewhere else entirely, in a separate part of the store, away from the other 3. She had not been burned as badly as the others, though she had suffered serious burns over roughly a quarter of her body. A sock-like piece of cloth was wrapped around her neck. Like the other girls, she had been shot in the head, but the first bullet, fired from the same small-caliber weapon used on the others, missed her brain. It should have ended things quickly for her, the same way it had for her friends. It didn't. Whoever did this then fired a second shot, from a completely different gun, a larger caliber pistol. This bullet did not miss. It tore through her brain and exited near her jaw. Investigators would later come to believe that Amy may have survived that first gunshot just long enough to try to get away, dragging herself into another room before her attacker caught up with her and finished what he came to do. The register had been emptied. The rear door was found unlocked, even though the front door had been locked from the inside, forcing firefighters to break in. To investigators, this all suggested the killer had entered and exited through the back, and that robbery may have at least been part of the motive. But nothing about the crime scene explained why it had escalated into something so calculated, so brutal, and so far beyond an ordinary robbery gone wrong. Autopsies would later confirm that at least 2 of the girls had been sexually assaulted before they were killed. The pressure on the Austin Police Department was enormous. This was not a random act of violence between strangers on the street. This was 4 teenage girls, tied up, controlled, executed, and then the building set on fire, all inside what should have been one of the safest places in the city. Detectives who worked the scene described it, in later years, as pure carnage, the kind of thing that stays behind your eyes long after you've left the room. But the fire had done more than damage the girls and destroy the building. It had also destroyed most of the physical evidence that might have identified their killer. Add in the water used to douse the flames, and what remained of the crime scene was a mess, both literally and forensically. Investigators believed, based on how organized and controlled the crime appeared, that they were likely looking for an adult, someone experienced, not a group of nervous teenagers. Within days, police arrested a 16-year-old named Maurice Pierce at a nearby mall. He was carrying a small-caliber handgun, the same make and model as one of the murder weapons. It seemed, for a moment, like a breakthrough. Under intense questioning, Pierce claimed he had lent his gun to a friend, 15-year-old Forrest Wellborn, and suggested Wellborn had used it in the murders. Wellborn denied any involvement, but admitted that he, Pierce, and two other young men, Robert Springsteen and Michael Scott, had taken a stolen car for a joyride sometime after the murders happened. That admission put all four names on the radar of investigators, but there was a problem. Ballistics testing could not confirm that Pierce's gun was actually the murder weapon, and one detective known for his aggressive interrogation tactics could not get Pierce to confess, no matter how hard he pushed. To some investigators at the time, that silence spoke volumes. If Pierce had done it, they believed he would have broken under that kind of pressure. Without solid evidence tying any of the four young men to the crime, they were released. The case went cold. Not silent, though. Tips poured in by the thousands. Task forces were formed, involving local police, the FBI, and federal firearms investigators. Behavioral experts even built a psychological profile of the kind of person they believed had done this. Likely young, likely male, likely someone with a history of trouble with authority, possibly someone who was already familiar with the yogurt shop itself. And in one of the strangest details of the entire case, over 50 separate people would eventually confess to committing the murders, including Kenneth McDuff himself, on the very day he was executed for a different crime. Every single one of those confessions turned out to be false. Years passed. The girls' families waited. Then, in 1999, nearly 8 years after the murders, a new detective took a fresh look at the case and zeroed in once again on the same four young men from 1991, Pierce, Wellborn, Springsteen, and Scott, now grown into their 20s. They were brought in for renewed questioning. This time, something changed. Under hours of intense interrogation, Michael Scott and Robert Springsteen each gave statements implicating themselves and each other in the murders. Springsteen's confession alone came after a videotaped interview lasting several hours. There was a serious problem lurking underneath these confessions, though. The original 1991 interrogations of these same men had never been recorded. That meant there was no way to know for certain whether investigators had, even accidentally, fed the suspects details about the crime scene that only the real killer should have known. Despite there being no physical evidence tying any of the four men to the murders, no hair, no fingerprints, no matching DNA, all four were arrested and charged with capital murder. Charges against Wellborn were eventually dropped after a grand jury declined to indict him. Charges against Pierce were also dropped for lack of evidence. But Springsteen and Scott went to trial separately, and prosecutors leaned almost entirely on their own recorded statements to secure convictions. It worked. In 2001, a jury convicted Robert Springsteen and sentenced him to death. The following year, Michael Scott was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. After years of appeals, and following a U.S. Supreme Court ruling that banned executing people for crimes committed as minors, Springsteen's death sentence was reduced to life without parole. To the public, and to the exhausted city of Austin, it finally looked like the case was closed. It wasn't. Starting in 2006, the convictions of both men began to unravel. Appeals courts ruled that using each man's confession against the other, without allowing either side to cross-examine the other in court, had violated their constitutional right to confront their accuser. Springsteen's conviction was overturned first, followed by Scott's. As prosecutors prepared to retry both men, they turned to a newer, more precise form of DNA analysis called YSTR testing, a method capable of isolating male DNA even from complicated, mixed biological samples. What came back stunned everyone involved. The male DNA recovered from the crime scene did not belong to Springsteen. It did not belong to Scott. It did not match Pierce or Wellborn either. It belonged to a completely unidentified man. In 2009, with an unknown killer's DNA sitting on the evidence, the Travis County District Attorney at the time announced she could not in good conscience send Springsteen and Scott back to trial. All charges were formally dismissed, and after roughly a decade in prison for a crime it now seemed increasingly likely they never committed, both men walked free. For Maurice Pierce, freedom did not last. In 2010, he was pulled over by Austin police. He fled on foot, and during the struggle that followed, he stabbed an officer in the neck before being shot and killed by that same officer. He never got to see his name cleared. The case went cold once again. Somewhere out there was a killer whose DNA sat in a database, completely anonymous, a ghost with no name and no face, while the families of 4 murdered girls were left with no real answers at all. For 16 more years, that DNA profile sat waiting. Then, technology finally began to catch up. Investigative genetic genealogy, the same kind of technique used to crack other infamous cold cases, allowed detectives to trace DNA, not just to a single suspect, but through entire family trees, narrowing possibilities down generation by generation, until a name finally surfaced. In the summer of 2025, an Austin cold case detective resubmitted old ballistics evidence. A .380 caliber shell casing recovered years earlier from a drain inside the yogurt shop into a national database used to match firearms across different crimes and different states. It came back linked to an unsolved 1998 killing in Kentucky. Then, weeks later, investigators in South Carolina delivered an even bigger breakthrough. A DNA sample recovered years earlier from underneath Amy Ayres's fingernails, evidence she had unknowingly preserved by fighting back against her attacker, matched a man connected to a brutal, unsolved 1990 murder in South Carolina. That man's name was Robert Eugene Brashers. On September 26, 2025, 34 years to the month after the fire that destroyed the yogurt shop, the Austin Police Department stood in front of cameras and finally announced who had killed Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah. Robert Eugene Brashers was not a stranger who slipped through the cracks by pure luck. He was, by every account investigators have since pieced together, one of the most dangerous and least recognized serial killers in modern American history, simply because he was never caught while he was alive. Born in 1958 in Virginia, Brashers spent parts of his childhood in Alabama and Indiana before eventually joining the military, though his service ended early due to personality issues. From there, he drifted, state to state, job to job, working construction, oil rigs, haystack repair, always moving, always changing his surroundings. In 1985, he was convicted of attempted murder after shooting a woman in Florida who had rejected his advances. He served only a few years before being released. After that, Brashers appears to have escalated into a long, hidden campaign of rape and murder across multiple states. Crimes that, for decades, no one connected to a single offender, simply because each was investigated by a different department, in a different state, with no shared databases to link them together. In 1990, he raped and strangled a woman in South Carolina. In 1997, he raped a 14-year-old girl in Tennessee after forcing his way into her home at gunpoint. In 1998, he shot and killed a mother and her 12-year-old daughter in Missouri, then attempted to attack another woman just hours later, only fleeing after she fought back hard enough to save her own life. That same year, he is believed to have murdered a woman in Kentucky, shooting her before setting her workplace on fire, chillingly similar to what happened in Austin 7 years earlier. Remarkably, just 2 days after the Austin murders, Brashers had been stopped by a Border Patrol checkpoint near El Paso, driving a stolen truck. Inside that truck, agents found a .380 caliber pistol, the same make and model used to kill Amy Ayers. He was arrested only for auto theft and illegal firearm possession. No one had any reason at the time to connect him to a quadruple homicide happening hundreds of miles away. The gun was eventually returned to his family, and Brashes would go on to use that very same weapon in at least 2 more murders. Throughout the 1990s, Brashes somehow maintained the appearance of an ordinary family man. His own daughter would later describe cookouts, birthday parties, an outwardly normal father, despite warning signs she only understood in hindsight. Strange aliases, disguises, unpredictable rage. His crimes finally caught up to him on January 13, 1999, when police in Kennett, Missouri, tracked a stolen vehicle to a motel parking lot. When officers moved in, they found Brashes hiding under a bed with a loaded gun. He took his own family hostage inside the room for several hours before eventually releasing them. Then, rather than surrender, he shot himself in the head. He survived for 6 more days before dying from his injuries. At the time, police simply believed they had ended a dangerous standoff with a violent fugitive. They had absolutely no idea they were also closing the book on a serial killer who had been operating almost invisibly for the better part of a decade. The forensic case against Brashes, once investigators finally connected the dots, turned out to be overwhelming. His Y-Sterdina profile matched the male DNA recovered from 3 of the 4 victims at the yogurt shop. His DNA also matched the sample recovered from beneath Amy Ayers' fingernails. Physical proof that she had fought her attacker with everything she had. And the ballistic pattern on that shell casing recovered from the shop's drain matched, almost perfectly, the gun Brashes used to shoot himself in Missouri. Investigators believe Brashes acted completely alone that night, despite decades of theories about multiple attackers. They also now believe he had no personal connection whatsoever to Austin, no family there, no known ties, nothing that would have ever put him on anyone's radar. He appears to have simply passed through the city that night, chosen his victims, and vanished before anyone even knew to look for him. For the families of Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah, the truth brought a strange, complicated kind of closure. The man responsible for destroying their daughters, their sisters, their friends, had been dead for more than 25 years. He would never sit in a courtroom. He would never face a jury. He would never once have to answer for what he did. In the months that followed, prosecutors moved to formally exonerate Springsteen, Scott, Pierce, and Welborn. On February 19, 2026, a Texas judge stood in a packed courtroom and formally declared all 4 men innocent, more than a quarter-century after their lives were first upended by an investigation that had gone catastrophically wrong. Michael Scott and Forrest Welborn were there to hear it in person. Robert Springsteen, who had once sat on death row for a crime he did not commit, chose not to attend. Maurice Pierce's widow and daughter stood in for him, since he never lived to see his name cleared. Austin's city council later approved a multi-million-dollar settlement for the men and Pierce's family, an attempt, however incomplete, to make up for the decades that were taken from them. The Austin yogurt shop murders remain one of the most haunting cases in American criminal history, not just because of the brutality of what happened to 4 young girls on an ordinary Friday night, but because of everything that went wrong afterward. 50 false confessions, 2 wrongful convictions. One of those men spent years staring down a death sentence for a crime he had nothing to do with, and the real killer walked free his entire life, never once suspected, continuing to hurt other people in other states, right up until the day he chose to take his own life rather than face arrest for an unrelated crime. It took 34 years, and it was Amy Ayers herself, in her final desperate moments, who gave investigators the one piece of evidence that eventually solved this case. By fighting back against the man who attacked her, she left his DNA under her fingernails, evidence that sat quietly waiting, decade after decade, until the technology finally existed to read it. Nothing can undo what happened inside that yogurt shop in December of 1991. Nothing can give Amy, Eliza, Jennifer, and Sarah back the lives that were taken from them. And nothing can give Springsteen, Scott, Pierce, and Wellborn back the years they lost for a crime they never committed. But after 34 years of false leads, false confessions, and false convictions, their families finally have the one thing they were owed from the very beginning: the truth. If this case shook you the way it shook us, make sure you're subscribed, because we cover cases exactly like this one, cold cases, where justice finally catches up, no matter how many years it takes.